Don't talk to me, I don't believe a word. Don't try to make me feel alright. All the love in all the world.
This is American Reckoning podcast, and we're gonna talk about slavery and slave narratives. So that's going to be the topic for today, and we'll get into kind of the Southern perspective about why slavery was not the primary, making the case that slavery was not the reason for the war between the states, War of Southern Independence. So we'll get into some slave narratives that were done back in 1936 and 38. But anyway, this is American Reckoning podcast. We talk a lot about Confederate history, Confederate ancestors, the South in general, and heritage and culture, and then how it all fits into the crazy world in which we live in today in our country in America, and the big Marxist push to destroy all history. We've always said the Confederate stuff is really easy pickings, low-hanging fruit for a lot of these people. You see it today. Look around you. A lot of we believe a lot of this came from the so-called Civil War, and has been happening since 1865. And one of the big narratives pushed by the northern states at the time, by Lincoln, by Yankees, has been that this whole big, incredible 650,000 death war was all about slavery. So we're going to get into that. So why don't I go ahead? So I'm going to be reading a couple of slave narratives, and these are the actual accounts of real slaves after a project was done by the government back in 1936 to 1938. So the book, I'm going to be kind of picking from a little bit here, a few excerpts on the slave narratives. It's this new book that came out. I don't know if you can see that. It's called Defending Dixies' Land. It was written by Isaac Bishop. It just came out. And this is what every American should know about the South and the Civil War. And this author, he's a self-professed Yankee, if you will, from Vermont. And
Vermont of all places.
Yeah, Vermont. You think it may be New Hampshire or something, but actually, Vermont. So anyway, the book, I just kind of started it, but immediately I can already tell it's got some really good information in it. A lot of facts that, of course, people would just love to erase these days. But so let me go ahead and start. I'm going to read. I'm going to open this with a quote from a slave. And this was written down in 1918. And I'm going to, I don't speak slave, but I'm going to try, because this is literally verbatim.
Phonetic. They wrote it down phonetically.
Yeah. I mean, it is the real accent of, a slave.
Now that's from 1918, you said?
Yeah. This particular quote's from I believe 1918.
Okay.
Or wait, no, this is, I'm sorry. I was looking at the next one. Pardon me. This is from the slave narrative. So this is from 1936. So
Did
here
they
I'll
record
quote
these. They originally had recordings of these.
Well, that's what I don't. I got to find out. They were transcribed from recordings, so I don't know if the original recordings exist. That's a good question.
Well, that's the only reason why I think they might have done them phonetically, which is why I bring it.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
You
exactly. So okay, here it goes. I sure would rather have slavery days back if I could have any same good masters. Us sure did have the best master in the world. If ever a man went to heaven, Marse Alex sure did. I sure does wish our good old master was living now. That's from Georgia Baker, Georgia Slave Narratives. And they did this throughout the South. Here's another quote. This is from Reverend William MacLeay, who was Robert E. Lee's servant during the war, in his book Life of Reverend William MacLeay, and this is from 1918. And he writes, I was raised by one of the greatest men in the world. There was never one born of a woman greater than General Robert E. Lee, according to my judgment. All of his servants were set free 10 years before the war, but all remained on the plantation until after the surrender. My master at his death left me $360 to educate myself with.
A lot of money in those days.
So, I mean, what the slave narratives really is an incredible body of work. And they've estimated that about 65%, give or take, of all the narratives that were recorded were positive of the South. And let me make, before we go on, I don't think this is the big duh moment where everybody is against slavery.
Right.
I mean,
right.
So nobody's defending slavery. This is ridiculous. No, everybody despises slavery, and that includes the slavery that goes on today, and the sexual slavery, the abduction of children and made into sex slaves, or slavery that happens to exist right over in communist China or anywhere else in the world,
or even the same old slavery in places like Saudi Arabia and Africa today.
Right.
Yeah.
So slavery, and then we start getting into, yes, in America it was primarily, well, almost exclusively black slavery. So black persons were slaves. In the rest of the world today, slavery has existed way before. We've heard it for thousands of years.
It's important to point out, sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
but it's important to point out that black people ended up being slaves in European places over in the Western Hemisphere and in the United States, not because they were black. It was because they were heathens.
Right.
Originally, when I think it was the Portuguese back in the maybe late 1400s that first started trafficking in slaves from Africa. They did so because the Pope basically said you can't enslave Christians anymore.
Right.
So they went to the nearest source of non-Christian slaves, and it was Africa. The Middle East, they could kind of fight back, so that wasn't the easiest place to go. And they were already ready to be picked up there. Pretty much, they already had plenty of slaves in Africa to sell them, and so that's how it got started. It ended up, of course, they ended up being all black. In the United States, but that's the reason. A lot of people don't realize that.
Yep. So, so slavery has existed. It exists today. It's very hidden. Just because you pay someone, again, this isn't a comparison between black slavery in the 1830s, 40s, 50s in America, in the Americas, versus that existed 1,000 years ago or of today. Slavery, I mean, you can almost call it slavery of the mind today, that a lot of Marxists are doing in their cult little freaking enterprise with everybody. But really, slavery, you could have someone in bondage, even though possibly you're even paying them, but the meager wage, basically their whole lives, you own their whole lives, their means of labor, their means of living, their means of feeding themselves, clothing themselves, everything is owned by you. You're making that person a slave. If somebody is manufacturing something in China and they're paying them, the barest of wages, to
a slave
exist,
wage, so to speak,
a slave wage,
right.
that in essence is slavery.
Yes.
Without going into the exact precise definition, I would consider that slavery.
Yeah.
If somebody is being used against their will,
right.
as these children are, who are taken from Latin American countries and brought across our border, and they're 12 years old, or even as young as 6 or 7 or 8 years old, and they are made to have sex and go into prostitution, that is sex slavery. It's probably, as you can read from some of these slave narratives, that type of slavery, which we are doing virtually almost nothing about, is far exceedingly worse than this. And as we read this,
especially by numbers, by the way, I mean, there are more slaves in the world today than there were back then, strangely enough.
Yeah. So we can get into the whole slavery issue, but we want to then get into and dispel later, after I read the slave narratives, we'll get into what the Southerners thought, what the Northerners thought over the issue of the war. Why did we go to war? And we'll answer this question here in a little bit, or we'll start to talk about it. But really, one question was brought up. What's the, and this was a kind of a left-wing guy that some of us had ran into. And he said, what is the point about making what the war was about not slavery? Why would you get into the reasoning that why your stance would be a cause for not being slavery?
In other words, for him, it was a foregone conclusion that it was.
Right, exactly. So this is what he'd been brought up, and we all went to public school. We all learned Lincoln and the Union Army was the best, and everything like that. So we've gone through it. But let me read you this real quick. This is from the theologian Thomas Smith, and he wrote, and what's called the unity of the human races proved to be the doctrine of Scripture, reason, and science. And Reverend James Thornwell, who wrote in response to the claims of Northern scientists like Samuel Morton and Louis Agassiz that blacks were a separate and lesser species from whites. And he
was Harvard.
Right, exactly. This is right out of the Northern colleges of the time, and this is in the 1850s. Yes, 1850. So let me read this to you about the response to that from the Southern perspective. It is a public testimony to our faith that the Negro is one blood with ourselves, that he has sinned as we have, and that he has equal interest with us in the great redemption. Science, falsely so called, may attempt to exclude him from the brotherhood of humanity by arguments which link them with the brute, but the instinctive impulses of our nature, combined with the plainest declarations of the Word of God, lead us to recognize in his moral, religious, and intellectual nature the same humanity which we glory as the image of God. We are not ashamed to call him brother. So this is from a reverend in response to the Northerners coming down and making claims about slaves in the South and blacks, that they're lesser and evolved from animals. That was Reverend J.H. Thornwell, The Rights and the Duties of Masters, Charleston, South Carolina. Walker and James, 1850. So let me read to you. Let me get on to where the slaves and listen to the words of slaves themselves. And I'll read a few of these because I think it's really important to hear that, because a lot of people do not, a lot of people don't look at history. They don't look at the first person accounts from the people that actually lived. You want to talk about that Marxist crap about lived experience? Well, these people really lived, and they were recorded and such. So, let me read here from North Carolina. This is so these are from North Carolina slave narratives. Seemed to love Master and Mrs. as much as they did their own mother and father, the way the children loved and trusted them. It was a beautiful sight to see. Master's children and the slave children played together. I run around with the baby girl Carrie to other plantations visiting. This is Mary Anderson, Slave Narratives. Marse John used to take me on his knee and sing, "Marster love, and chillin's on his plantation. I think slavery was a right good thing. Yes, slavery as a pure good thing." Emma Blaylock, North Carolina Slave Narratives. The rest of the family was all fine folks and good to me, but I love Miss Ella better than anyone or anything else in the world. She was the best friend I ever had. If I ever wanted for anything, I just asked her, and she'd give it to me. or got it for me somehow. That's from Betty Cofer, North Carolina Slave Narratives. Samuel Riddick said, and again, these are all quotes. I quote, I haven't anything to say against slavery. My old folks put my clothes on me when I was a boy. They gave me shoes and stockings and put them on me when I was a little boy. I love them, and I can't go against them in anything. Samuel Riddick. This is from Wayne Holiday, Mississippi, Slave Narrative. Our master's name was Colonel John Holiday. He and Miss Julia, that was his wife, was mighty good to us, and so was Marse Tom and Marse Ben and Marse Maria and all. Marse Ben went after that. He was just old enough to go, but he went and fought just the same, meaning the war. He come back when the war was over, and they would show some rejoicing. This is another Mississippi slave. My young master used to work in the field with us. His boss, he'd bossed the N-word. I'll just say Negroes, but you can read between the line. They called him Bud, but we all called him Babe. Honey, I sure did love that boy. I loved him a lot. Susan Snow, Mississippi. Another one here, Miss Candace Goodwin from Virginia. My white people, they good to me. Why, I always just like days chilling and playing with them. And we'd be asleeping with them. Never had no work to do in them days except in nursing the babies. 'Twas just like play. 'Twas no work. Why, we chillin' used to have a time rolling around Mrs. Place, all us chillin' as to get together and go in the woods to play. Yes, they white and blackens too. Them was good old times. And I tell you, honey, Mrs. Candace Goodwin, Virginia.
Those are hard to read, aren't they?
They're really hard to read because, boy, let me tell you, talk about Southern and black Southern folks, boy, they can, you talk about Deep South. There's nothing to be ashamed of with that as far as I'm concerned. But this is from Betty Bormer in Texas slave. Martha Johnson was good to us colored folks, and he feeds us good. He kept lots of hogs that makes the meat and the smokehouse and hung up meat enough for feed the army. It looks like if Wiens gets into trouble to come to him and he would help us. He sure do that too, because the Negroes, read between the lines, goes to him lots of times and he always helps us.
Wow, they're using the N-word.
Oh yeah. In fact, I haven't read it a few times here, but the N-word is used prodigiously through these, but that's okay.
Well, these are black folks referring to it that way.
Right. We white folks can't say it, so that's why I kind of be careful. Otherwise, God knows what happens.
Yeah.
When Martha died, now here's one more. I'll read this one and then we'll kind of move on here. When Martha died, that was my first real sorrow. 3 years later, Mrs. then passed away. That was the time of my second sorrow. Then I reminded myself of a little tree out there in the woods in November. With every sharp and cold wind of trouble that blowed, more leaves of that tree turned loose and went to the ground, just like they was trying to follow her. It seemed like when she was gone, I was just like that tree with all the leaves gone, naked and friendless. It took me a long time to get over all that. Same way with the little tree, it had to pass through the winter and wait on spring to see life again. Ezra Williams, South Carolina. So, laws designed to protect slaves and corporal punishment. This book goes into quite a bit of information where you're talking, and these are all cited. Dispel some of the Uncle Tom's Cabin stuff, all this other. Remember, so many things were propagandized because of this war, and that's what we're taught in the school. That's that's what we're forced to believe. And what's sad, I think, is how Republicans today, the conservatives, true conservatives, maybe you can help distinguish what Republicans are thinking today and how they they're glued to this narrative. And you even hear talk show hosts talk about putting down the South and all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine a lot of this stuff, a lot of them don't have a particular interest, and you've heard me point this out before. And they don't have a particular interest in history, and of course, they don't want to get involved in historical arguments about what meant what, and they would just as soon not have it part of something they have to deal with in a complicated political world. And so I think that's the motivation for most Republicans that consider themselves conservative today, not standing up for the South. It's and I can understand that from a tactical perspective, though it is intellectually dishonest. And
I mean, they're trying to win votes today at the expense of the South, and it just suits them well. But it's intellectually dishonest. It's flat out wrong.
Yeah, it's
factually wrong, and it's so infuriating because it's like,
it's frustrating. The ones like who should be standing up for it aren't. And
they call themselves constitutional conservatives. They call themselves true conservatives, but they're the ones who are tied to nationalism, to Lincoln and the way. So they're happy with the war result when not even realizing that's not conservative.
Well, and
the true.
It's not only that. That's not the war. I mean, that was we're talking about, say, the slavery abolition. That was a consequence of the war. It wasn't a primary cause. And it certainly wasn't what most people on either side were fighting about most of the time.
So we'll bring up this point, and I wanted to get back to this. What's the point about making the war not about slavery? So we'll take on this rhetorical question here. Why does it matter that it was not about slavery? Again, this was asked by some left-wing citizen, and
I don't know how right or left-wing he considered himself, but that's one thing he mentioned.
And so the vast majority of people, so the reason to answer his question is, what did you say about the vast majority of people are taking the wrong lessons from the horrible conflict?
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about it. History is supposed to have utility. I mean, it's interesting, to learn about history. It's fun to know the stories and all that stuff. But one of the biggest things we do is utilize history and trying to understand what's going on. And when you don't have the history correct, you take the wrong lesson.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why the commonly kind of understood narrative about the war is so terrible, because the actual thing that was lost there was
states' rights.
Well, yeah,
not the real principle
of federalism. I mean, true federalism is really what was lost. So yeah, you could say states' rights, but really the federal government turned from a federal republic, not a unitary republic, not to basically a national democracy. You hear everybody talking about our democracy today. We're not supposed to be having a national democracy. The Constitution actually itself is a document that works against democracy. It was meant to be that way because, well, we'll get into that some other time, but people have the complete wrong idea about what the Constitution's for. But anyway, it worked pretty well up until the time of Lincoln. That's really what was lost, was our federalism. States' rights is of course integral to that.
Yeah, I mean, if it just sounds better that to the ear and to your own self-righteous way to slip in that this war was about liberating black slaves, that this was a black slave liberation. A war was about that. And anything to the contrary, you'd be taking the wrong lesson in this, which is, it's totally beside the point of what the true essence of what the war was. And the Northerners knew it.
Well,
the people like Lincoln, the Hamiltonians of the time, they knew, because they had been remember, prior to the war, they had been fighting for put slavery on aside for a second. They had been fighting for a consolidated, centralized authority, a consolidated government. That's how they viewed. So the Federalist Papers it was the origin of defending the Constitution. to acquiesce to the New Yorker contingent.
The Federalist Papers were, obviously they're a compilation of letters, and those letters were written and published under various pseudonyms for the purposes of convincing primarily the people of the state of New York to ratify the Constitution. It didn't have much pull beyond that, but well, I could get into what it actually said versus a bunch of things that people were saying at the time. But yes, that's seen as kind of the Bible to a lot of modern nationalist Republicans, who claim to be conservative, but when they totally disregard other things that were available at the time, and they shouldn't do that. But,
yeah, I mean, so the issue, getting the issue of slavery as the cause of the war is disingenuous. You're talking about a states' rights issue, a individual liberties issue as they saw it at the time. Slavery, yes, bad, legal at the time though, but bad. They were already thinking, and many, especially the Southern officers and other people who were landowners, were already starting to divest themselves of their slaves. They knew this would take time, but really, the economic freedom and the viableness of their state that they loved, as they saw as their country, was the primary reason. So if you get into an intellectual conversation with anybody, and it's a true rational debate on any kind of topic, you want to get to the root cause of what the problem was. Slavery is not part of that root cause scenario.
It was a consequence. It was
a consequence.
It was almost completely incidental. Now there were some causal factors, but those revolved around kind of social. I might get into this later, but
yeah, I mean, you're talking about, again, the boogeyman. They want to bring up the boogeyman, which is slavery. And make that the narrative, and that issue, the expansion of the central power of the time versus power of individuals was the real issue at play here. And so,
one thing that might be useful to point out is people often bring up the declarations for why they seceded that were published by 4 of the original 7 Southern states to secede. I could get into what they did there, but in those documents, they were not defending slavery or saying it was a cause for war or something like that. If the purpose of that war were slavery, there's another place you can look to try and find something out about that, and that's the northern states that published declarations for why they went to war, why they invaded the South, and they did not mention slavery. So if this, and not only that, guys like Lincoln were, swearing up and down, it had nothing to do with that. And in reality, it didn't. Lincoln said over and over it was about his tariffs. That was his justification for the Anaconda strategy and why he blockaded all the ports in the South. His argument was that the states never seceded and they owed the federal government taxes, basically.
Right.
And considering that's where 90% of the federal revenue came from, you can see why they were up in arms about it, those southern ports.
Yeah.
But that was amongst the primary causes.
Yeah, I mean, let me read this real quick, and this, again, I'm moving away from the slavery cause because that's not what the thinking was at the time. I'm going to read something real quick, and this is also from the book Defending Dixie's Land. And this is written in 1822. This is Thomas Jefferson, and he's writing to William Barry, and he says, quote, advancing with a noiseless and steady pace to the great object of consolidation. The foundations are already deeply laid by their decisions for the annihilation of constitutional state rights and the removal of every check, every counterpose to the engulfing power of which themselves are to make a sovereign part. If ever this vast country is brought under a single government, you will have to choose between reformation and revolution. It was written 2 days before the Declaration of Independence, 1822. So, all of us are taught today that the outcome of the Civil War, quote unquote, is the presumptive correct outcome. And yes, if you believe in a central one union where states no longer have the sovereignty that they once did, that they were Jefferson's pointing this out here, that this consolidation is going to completely annihilate the state sovereignty aspect, and that's what the Southerners were mad about. Would go to war. Remember, look what's happening today. I mean, we are seeing the result of a complete consolidated government. Nobody's happy. All our freedoms are gone. Not only our states are hanging on by a thread, but they're being bribed, right? They're being coerced to accept federal money all the time. In education, every freaking thing that our country is doing is started with the loss in the Civil War. And look, I mean, that is a I'm waiting for the freak shows to come and arrest me now. But I'm be honest with you, that is exactly what the problem is.
Yeah.
That is where the United States as we knew it ended. And be honest with you, the South was right.
It's amazing what people say about the Confederate Constitution. It was basically a copy of the United States Constitution, and actually had a number of improvements. And it did not make slavery, perpetual or anything like that. There's lots of rumors out there about that, but it does no such thing.
I mean, these people want to go so far. Is if you even have an opinion that this war was not against slavery, you need to be alienated. You need to be ostracized. You need to be censored. That you somehow have this evil, sinister plan of you're really a racist and a white supremacist, and you hear and that's why we tie it back to Marxism too, because the Marxists have jumped all over this.
Yeah, well, actually, they're the cause of it to a large extent. I mean, these are
the burgeoning Marxists
these are Marxist tactics. They've been used for a long time, and they're attaching these types of things to their divisive, methodology.
Yeah. I mean, it's Marxism that's a scary thing. It's like we've been taught. We talk all the time about the Southern perspective of things, and truly believing that had things. Think about it. Just play that game of where, say, so-and-so had won the war or whatever. What if the South had won the war? Would we still be marching towards a consolidated government, or Marxism, if you will? Or maybe, but it sure as heck would have been checked. And so I guarantee you one thing, too. Slavery as a hideous institution would have died.
Yeah.
Through the advent of industrial advances and through the other economic realities of the time that would have
1830. Man, I've said this before. 1831 or 33. I always forget the year. 1833, of course, was the year that Britain abolished slavery in their realm, and they did it through a process known as compensated emancipation,
right?
Kind of, and so
which the Southerners actually tried to compromise with Lincoln to avoid war. So one of those types of things was, hey, let's.
People started to propose that after the war was started, and those were people in the North then. So that was keep in mind, before the war there was no plan emancipation put forward by anybody,
by any North or South.
Yeah, anybody, North or South, except for one political party, the abolitionists, and they called for immediate and uncompensated emancipation.
Yeah, which is not compensated.
Completely, it's completely unreasonable, you know.
And that's why they were extremists of the time.
They were
like
radicals, and they actually objected. Garrison himself, the leader of that movement, actually opposed the British plan because it included compensation. It wasn't good enough that they'd come to a resolution and had a way to do it. And if you look at all of the Western countries that abolished slavery, they tended to do it in a reasonable way. And of course, again, our so-called Civil War was not about this. It was a consequence of it, which is why that happened. But that is what the abolitionists as a political party were calling for. But they were the only ones. Nobody else really had much of an interest in this. And Lincoln himself was not a fan of the abolitionists.
Right.
He wouldn't let him near him until parts latter part of the war. But anyway.
So yeah, we have a problem today with conservatives, so-called intellectuals, people who should be, you would think, intellectually dishonest, but it's almost like, unless you really know what the facts are, the real truth of things, you're proud of your ancestors, you're proud of your Southern heritage, you're proud of what the Confederate soldiers and the Confederacy was trying to accomplish. And remember, they were not trying to overthrow Lincoln. They just wanted out of this corrupt
That's right.
system.
Technically, it was
they
not
wanted
a civil war.
out, man.
It was not a civil war, technically. They were fighting on the basis of separation the entire time.
And it was not over keeping their slaves, as we've said so many times.
Well, of course, most people
5% of the only 5% of soldiers who ever fought in the Civil War for the South, probably more were in the North. Only 5%, if that.
Yeah,
it had slaves. It was not about. They were not fight. You could read their letters. It had nothing to do. Oh, I'm fighting because I want to.
Well, and most people in the South didn't own slaves, and some ironic people in the North who did own slaves were Sherman when he lived in Louisiana,
Lincoln,
Grant, and Lincoln through his wife's estate owned slaves, and sold them. Yeah,
Lincoln. Hey, fact check.
Yeah,
Lincoln owned slaves and sold them. So that's something Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson did not do. Yeah. They did not sell slaves.
In all fairness, Jackson owned two.
He owned two. Okay.
Yeah. But Lee said.
But he emancipated them, right? He didn't sell them off, as far as I know.
I think he had them up until his death, but because he owned them when he was at VMI.
He was okay.
Yeah, he owned a few acres outside of town and had a couple of slaves, but he was actually broke the law in a good way and had a school where he taught slave kids how to read and write, which people tried to take issue with him on, and he told them to.
He had taught them a Christian,
Yeah, and that was a big part of it. So he was a good guy on that front. Robert E. Lee, on the other hand, did emancipate his slaves, which were inherited it was the exact same circumstance
as Lincoln. Yeah, he inherited them, and then as part of the trust. Emancipated them as according to the estate that he was
exactly the opposite of what your popular history would suggest.
Right.
And I'll also point out some of these so-called conservatives, a lot of these Republicans, a lot of these people were really good students in school. And so what did they do? They studied what was assigned.
Right.
They weren't, and probably didn't study history in college, most of them. I mean, for real. And so don't have context for this. So the common narrative of the great emancipator and all that kind of stuff, which was perpetuated in what country, the United States in this case, is going to teach history that says that it's no good. You know what I mean? Because that's really, if you get to the truth of that war, the Union was in the wrong, and as far as constitutionality and everything goes. And if you want to talk about the slaves they did free, one of the first uses of concentration camps really happened when you had all of these slaves that were freed by the armies, kind of as they were going through
by the Union Army.
Well, and don't forget the Emancipation Proclamation didn't specifically only supposedly freed slaves in the South,
right?
With under Lincoln's notion that these states never seceded, they were still, and so therefore you're all free.
Right.
But and it's very short. Anyone can read the Emancipation Proclamation. It's full text. It's not difficult. In 5 minutes. It's not a long read. It's like just a couple pages, but a couple sections. But it specifically excludes, any place in Louisiana that the Union occupied, any West Virginia, every northern state that might have slaves, including the northern slave states,
right,
of New Jersey, Maryland,
Delaware,
Kentucky, and West Virginia.
Yeah.
To what extent it existed at the time, I'm not sure at what point of theirs. It was all in 63. So anyway,
and so holding the slaves there.
Yeah, so you could totally have slaves in any of those areas. And so, but nonetheless, they ended up with a lot of slaves following the armies around after the northern armies would be marching around various places that had slaves, and they would destroy the plantation. The slaves would start following around. So they, along the Mississippi and in various places, they developed these big camps where they just threw them, and tens of thousands, if not more.
It's not reported.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands possibly were. I don't know the exact number. I don't know if anyone does, but just a bunch of disease. They just threw them in these camps and just kept them there.
And I would guess, I mean, if anecdotally, at least to some degree, you have 60%, 65% of the slaves who had nothing good to say about their plantations after the war in 1936 to 38, that when the Union Army came through the South and destroyed these plantations, they destroyed everything on the plantation.
Right.
Lucky to keep the home if that wasn't burned. Yeah. They burned all the outbuildings. They killed all the livestock. They destroyed all the crops.
Yeah.
All the corn cribs, everything you could do, all the equipment, every implement. So what are the slaves gonna do? They can't even stay there if they're alone if they could. Yeah. So they had to fight.
They had nowhere to go.
Yeah. There's Sherman and his army coming through. What the heck are the slaves going to do but follow the army? They've got the food, and then they throw them into a camp.
Yep.
Just come on, man. People better find out a little bit more about their history.
Yeah.
And it's not. Look, we're all Americans. We get it. We love our country even now. But man, people better start looking at the real nature of why this war was not about slavery, why the Southerners are right, why it's been so overlooked and propagandized in the other direction.
It's interesting how I ended up in, with a lot of the knowledge I have now. I started doing this, getting on this kind of field of study, the kind of the political history and all this, and it's because years ago, I asked myself the question, why is the states' rights thing so difficult? Isn't that supposed to be part of federalism? Don't we have, it's called the federal government, but it hasn't truly been federal basically since this time.
Right.
Yes, but yeah, I asked myself the question, years ago, why is this so difficult? And it's because our country was nationalized, our federal republic was destroyed, and a nationalist government took its place. Between the precedent set during the war by Lincoln and then later on the 14th Amendment, which is a complicated amendment, and there's lots of questions about how legitimate its ratification was, because seceded states were considered not states in one sense, but were required to ratify as if they were in another, and it's an interesting historical debate. But yeah, so I kind of ended up here, as a result of asking that question, and it's undeniable. There's this modern understanding of it, but most of that was artificial. It was manufactured after the war. Sure, there was some anti-slave sentiment. Most of the anti-slave sentiment in the North, however, didn't center around the moral argument, though some certainly did. It centered around the labor argument.
Right.
They didn't want slaves to be competing with free white labor.
That's right.
And this is reflected in the fact that being black was illegal in most places in the North. And they didn't just not want slavery, they didn't want black people. That can't be emphasized enough. Whereas up until the early 1830s, when guys like Garrison started getting real loud and obnoxious, there were many, many more anti-slave societies in the South.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Southerners were the leading anti-slavery advocates up until the 1830s.
Yeah, and in fact, one podcast, just to break in real quick, that we want to do is this notion that slavery originated in the South. That slavery, because the whole notion, you have to remember, prior to, like, in the, I think it was the mid to early 1700s, and prior to that, the South wanted no part of slavery. They tried to ban slavery. It was imposed upon them. It was brought by Northern merchants into the South to create a market in the South. And there's documents in Virginia where they were like, no, we don't want these slaves.
Massachusetts was involved in the slave trade for like 170 plus years.
So
all the primary importers were Rhode Island, Massachusetts, I mean, it's
there's a lot of history out there that's
every state had slaves at the time of the founding of the United States.
Yep.
Every single one. You hear this garbage, and I've said it before, where some people have this idea that all the stuff about slavery was put into the Constitution to appease Southern states. It was,
that's crap.
The narrative has just been so manipulated for various rhetorical reasons, just over time, but in particular after the war. It was a terrible war. Nobody thought it was going to be that bad, and everybody had to make up a big story about why it was so important. So
we'll look into more slavery stuff in a future podcast, to try to, because there's so much information, there's so much misinformation. And look, if there's anything that factually that comes out, especially with this podcast, feel free to post it or comment, because we're not historians per se. We're just average citizens looking to try to find, and Americans just kind of looking to find the real reasoning for things and why things are covered up and why our country exists the way it does today.
Right.
Because you're seeing the effects, most of it negative. I mean, look what's happening around us.
Right.
It is scary. And I'm believe me, I'm not one to get scared very much, and I know you aren't either, but Lord have mercy, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And we, again, our American Reckoning podcast, we try to look at that from the Southern perspective, and we point out some of the Marxist tendencies. It's a full-on onslaught now. There's no tendencies. It's full on. But again, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to add to that, none of that stuff would be, the threats would be possible, really, if we had the Federal Republic most people assume we still have.
Right. That's a very good point. You just said, that so many Americans, especially conservatives, and even they see it hanging on by a thread, but assume that we have a Federal Republic. We no longer have a Federal Republic.
Yeah.
Your central government owns you. They farm you.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, that road lies complete destruction of this beautiful union, if you want to call it that. So people should be paying attention and getting involved and trying to get their government back, local, state, the whole thing, and holding local people accountable, because there's a lot of people that are looking to bring this American experiment to an end and reconstitute it or reimagine it into something wholly different. And it is a evil direction, and we need to correct the situation. So pointing out our true history is a good step in that direction. At least it and again, none of us are pro-slavery, white supremacists, racist freaks, or anything like that. I mean,
we should point out that there are extreme people on the
left
who've been fed mostly by Democrat politicians some idea that there are people in this country that want to put black people back in bondage, which is the most absurd thing.
What did Biden say?
which
Republicans want to put you back in chains.
Yeah.
You know what?
I mean,
remember that crap that idiot said?
I mean,
We want to put you back in chains.
Democrats
you
running for
freaking
office,
lions, skank.
you know, in cities, you know, have been doing that type of campaigning for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been happening for a long time.
Yeah. We'll get into this discussion more about so-called conservatives. I'm dying to do this one where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party has shifted or whatever. The Republican Party is the same. They're just happen to be, as you called it, I know you said it really well, where the Republican Party today is actually left. But
right.
the Democrat Party has taken an unrun around that left and gone even more freak show left.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that because there's a huge misunderstanding about the political parties and real conservative versus this so-called
radical
Republican of today who want to be Republican and they think they're conservative, but they're not. And we're pointing out some reasons why. So I think we'll leave it there. And
cool.
Believe me, I wish we can keep on talking, but man. So again, it's American Reckoning podcast. Don't forget, we have a YouTube page at American Reckoning, the @ symbol at American Reckoning. You can find us, make sure and comment. If whether you agree or not, whatever, make sure you like the page. Make sure you can subscribe to our page because we got more of these coming out. We all work for a living, so we're trying to do these as best we can. And then we're also on Rumble as well, so you can look for at American Reckoning podcast. I think it's under. So thanks. Appreciate y'all being with us. And I'm Paul. He's Aaron. So we'll see y'all next time.
I have advice.